This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, today is an auspicious day. Exactly 20 years ago today, in 2005, was our inaugural episode of Arab Talk at KPOO in San Francisco. And it's been an amazing 20-year ride. We're going to review some of that history of Arab Talk at KPOO and nationally and internationally. It's amazing that we've been on the air for 20 years. But in the midst of our 20 years of Arab Talk, we obviously are facing an immense historical moment when it comes to the genocide in Palestine, especially in Gaza. Israel has weaponized starvation. As you know, today the United Nations announced that at least 1/3 of the population of Gaza's children are on the brink of imminent starvation and death, with the remaining facing imminent starvation. But at least 1/3 are facing imminent death. Hundreds of rabbis, by the way, are demanding that Israel stop using starvation as a weapon of war. And what we're beginning to see for the first time in close to 2 years, Jamal, is a slight shift among world leaders when it comes to the deprivation, the genocide, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. We've been talking about it, but we see a small shift in world leaders, which we're going to talk about today. And that includes the fact that France and Emmanuel Macron has decided that France will acknowledge and basically honor the fact that there is a Palestinian state. So they will acknowledge that Palestine is a state, and that's going to be a big move. We're also going to talk about yet another humanitarian ship, the Handala, illegally boarded by the Israeli military, again, in international waters. The fact that they boarded in international waters, Jamal, means that it was done illegally. Again, this ship, the Handala, was slated to bring diapers, formula, and necessary life-saving medical supplies to Palestinians in Gaza. And, we have to talk a little bit today, Jamal, about how the news media, including the New York Times and all mainstream media, have been complicit in sustaining Israel's ongoing genocide. A report came out in the last 24 hours, and finally the New York Times said something about it. But basically, calling on the world journalism community to allow independent journalists into Gaza, which it hasn't done by Israel, but also to acknowledge the fact that journalists in Gaza are starving to death. And after 22 months, Jamal, finally the New York Times has decided to say something. I'm afraid it's a little too late, and we will talk about the New York Times and the mainstream media's complicity in the genocide in Gaza.
You're right, Jess. Many stories to cover today, so hopefully we'll go over all these stories within this hour. But again, as you mentioned, it's been 20 years since we launched the show on KPO in San Francisco, 89.5 FM. And we started basically on the radio, and then we experimented with streaming it, and then the video and so forth. And now it's on multiple platforms, and we're really appreciative. We started with the war on Iraq. I mean, people don't talk about that now. It's we came on the heels of the war on Iraq, basically talking about it. We've covered what happened in 2006 in Gaza and Lebanon, multiple stories. And here we are 20 years later, and we're still talking about the Israeli occupation in Palestine that basically has expanded its occupation to now we are witnessing a genocide, which many people might want to deny, but it's undeniable. I've counted over 18 to 20 human rights organizations saying it's a genocide. I've counted this many organizations also saying that we have now mass starvation, yet you hear politicians saying, no, it's not starvation. We're coming to rescue the people in Gaza. Those same people who are denying basically that there's starvation, now they're saying, oh, we need to have some airdrops of food and so forth. But I don't know. Can you deny what your eye sees, Jess, and what you hear and eyewitnesses?
Yeah.
We've witnessed in the past basically 2 years the deliberate targeting and killing of more than 200 journalists, and still, as you've mentioned, international journalists are prohibited from going into Gaza and documenting these war crimes. But I want to go back quickly just to reminisce a little bit about the show, because we've had so many credible people on our show. I want to acknowledge all of our guests. I want to see. Listen, I'm gonna miss a lot of the names. I mean, we can't name all the names. That all of our
No,
great
no. I
great
mean, it's
guests.
Jamal, it's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that we've interviewed over 20 years.
Exactly.
And
So
I also want to remember we interviewed each other when each of us respectively was in Palestine. There are a couple of interviews of you interviewing me when I was in Gaza and me interviewing you when you were in Palestine, and we were both in Gaza on a couple of occasions reporting. So it's pretty amazing when you think about the last 20 years.
That's right. So I'm just gonna go quickly through some of the names. That we've had like multiple appearances by Dr. Hatem Bazian, Dr. Rabab Abdel Hadi, Diana Bhutto, attorney Stanley Cohen, but then we've had the famous rapper Low Key from Britain, journalist Abby Martin, the Palestine rapporteur, United Nations rapporteur Francesca Albanese, Dr. Rashid Khalidi, Dr. Matt Gilbert, Richard Falk, former CNN reporter. We've had Green Party presidential candidate, Dr. Jill Stein. We had Dr. Asad Abu Khalil, Jonas Ali Bunima,
I mean, it's amazing.
author and Professor Avi Shleim, Israeli journalist Amira Haas, the former executive director of the Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, Brazilian political cartoonist Carlos Latouf, author and human rights activist Miko Peled. I mean, did I miss how many people did I miss? How many
You
people
missed
do
a
you
couple.
remember?
You
I
missed a
forgot
couple.
to mention former CNN reporter Arwa Damon.
Yeah, yeah,
Started by
yeah.
saying that, but I didn't say the name. Um, who
Well, let
else
me
did I
just say,
miss?
you missed a couple of hundred people, but that's okay. Before we get to some of those other names, I want to just give our viewers and listeners a little historical context. This show would not exist were it not from the result of a phone call from our dear departed brother, Terry Collins. May he rest in peace and power. It was over 20 years ago that Terry called us in the wake of, the Iraq War, the invasion and destruction of Iraq after 9/11. And he called us and said, we need more representation of Arab voices and Palestine. And this, Terry Collins, who is a giant in the community, was the one who kind of encouraged us to be part of KPOO over 20 years ago. And we want to thank the memory of Terry and his family for the his courage. In addition to Terry Collins, of course, we have JJ, the our kind of fearless leader at KPOO, who threw thick and thin, Jamal, when we were being attacked, when Arab Doc was being attacked both locally, nationally, and globally. JJ remained steadfast in his, commitment to free speech and independent journalism, and he has always stood with us, shoulder to shoulder. So we always want to give a shout out to JJ and the KPOO community within San Francisco and the greater Bay Area, which is where we got our start. So I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned Terry Collins and JJ and the KPOO staff and community who've always been with us, Jamal. It's pretty amazing that we've been on air for 20 years, if you think about it.
Right. Moving on to our stories and the story of the day and story of the week, story of the month, story of two
Story
years.
of the decade, of the century.
Israel is has weaponized starvation. They've tried everything. They dropped those 5,000-pound bombs on the population of Gaza. They've destroyed hospitals. They've killed doctors and journalists and civilians and children. And now, I guess that's their new tactic. It's not that new because Israel has been counting the calories of people in Gaza, as you know, and we've talked about that by monitoring the calories of the people there and allowing X number of trucks to enter. And they reduced that to nothing. I mean, just as we're speaking today, they just had few tons dropped by air from Jordan. I guess the Jordan Air Force dropped some food and some from the UAE, and I assume now some trucks are going to enter from Egypt. But that's the first that we've heard about in the past several weeks because people are starving. And now you have evidence, as I've mentioned, from multiple organizations, one of which is Amnesty International, and said that evidence gathered by them demonstrates how over a month since the introduction of its militarized aid distribution, Israel has continued to use starvation of civilians as a weapon of war, uh, not only against Palestinians in Gaza, but also in other places, and deliberately impose conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction as part as of its ongoing genocide. They've gathered just heartbreaking testimonies gathered from medical staff, from parents of children whose children are hospitalized because of malnutrition, displaced Palestinians struggling to survive. I mean, the image is horrifying. What you see on the internet, what you hear online, and so forth, it's all real. People are starving there, and these accounts just show you the catastrophic suffering caused by Israel's ongoing restrictions. Just
Well,
it's unbelievable. I mean, I don't know who else has to give you that story. They don't believe the doctors. They don't believe the nurses. They don't want to believe the human rights organizations. They don't believe all these NGOs telling you, no, 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 we don't think it's starvation, and everybody else is telling you it is starvation. And then again, just to mention, then you have this new scheme, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, where hundreds of Palestinians have been killed and thousands injured, either near militarized distribution sites or en route to humanitarian aid convoys. So people cannot escape death and destruction any which way you look at it.
well, Jamal, the images don't lie. I could say that most Palestinians are kind of exhausted physically and emotionally at the fact that the world has turned its back on this genocide and starvation of children in Gaza and throughout historic Palestine. It is extraordinary that after 22 months, after screaming about the ethnic cleansing, the images, the sound, the interviews, the independent news reports uh, from everywhere, from NGOs, from the United Nations, that the world has stood by letting this genocide and the starvation of children happen. I want to. I think there's kind of an exhaustion about it, and we're going to kind of talk about this a little bit today. That you see these slight movements, where some world leaders are saying, "Yeah, the starvation is really bad." The New York Times says, "Oh yeah, journalists are starving." I 100% believe it's too little, too late. I mean, this will go down in history as among the most grotesque. Um, Violation of human rights, the most profoundly kind of depraved genocide in the modern era, by far, Jamal, because nowhere in the modern era has the world had to bear witness to it. In the past, before social media or the distribution of images, you know, these horrific things could happen, but the world wouldn't find out about it until later. And then there was an outrage. Now we have live streaming of a genocide and of starvation of children, Palestinian children, and nobody did anything about it. And the fact that now you have Macron, you have Starmer, you have some of these other world leaders saying, "Oh, this is not good. This is bad," and for the first time, the Israeli government is starting to maybe change their tune a little bit about, at least through images. I don't think the reality on the ground is different, but showing images of airdrops, for example. But what they're not telling you, Jamal, is that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of food on trucks at the border with Egypt waiting to come in that are continued to deny entry. So this, in my opinion, what we're seeing now is kind of a media campaign because Israel and the Israeli government is losing the PR campaign. They know it. They are a pariah government. The United States is losing the PR campaign. They are a complicit government in this genocide. But the real tragic news, Jamal, is that no matter how much food is let into Gaza, there's going to be thousands, tens of thousands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands of children that will die from starvation because you can't just feed starving children and they will survive. It takes months and months of constant nutrition and medical monitoring to overcome the effects of months of starvation that Palestinian children have experiencing. So the catastrophe, even with these images, Jamal, continues. It's really depraved and tragic.
Well, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, as of the 15th of June of this year, a total of 18,741 children were hospitalized for acute malnutrition since the beginning of the year. So
Right,
remember, we're now at the end of July. We don't, that's this information is a month and a half old. I don't have the
right.
new information because they haven't tabulated this. And according to the figures obtained from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, and I'll mention something about this in the New York Times, the under 5 mortality rate for 2024 in Gaza was recorded at 32.7 deaths per 1,000 live births, representing a sharp increase compared to the 13.6 rate reported in 2022. Maternal mortality has also more than doubled from an estimated 19 deaths per 100,000 live births in 2022 to 43 deaths per 100,000 in 2024. And the list is long. There are all these different measures. And the reason I've mentioned the New York Times in this because, which we'll talk about the bias that we've witnessed from the New York Times, is that the New York Times used to dispute these figures and say, for example, the figures supplied or by the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza are kind of false. And recently, for the first time, they admitted to say, no, these figures are pretty accurate because we compare them to other reports and so forth. So they went on for almost 2 years telling you that basically they haven't trusted the figures about the number of journalists killed, the numbers of people died, the infant mortality, and so forth. And now they're saying, no, you know what? These figures are pretty accurate. And talking about children, all right, more than 100,000 children under the age of 2, including 40,000 infants, are facing the imminent threat of mass death. And that's why I feel it's because of these reports they're facing the imminent threat of mass death within days due to the complete lack of infant formula and nutritional supplements. I think it's not about the conscience of the word. I think there is a panic, not the Israelis, because if you read, don't listen to the Israelis on the sound bites on Fox News and CNN, wherever. Read their media, read their Hebrew media, and they'll tell you they're not happy to allow a single drop of water or an ounce of food enter. They're debating that amongst themselves, and they're saying we need to starve them to death to get rid of them. You have Israeli settlers at the crossings of these trucks, attacking these trucks and trying to burn them and so forth. They are encouraging that starvation. They want to see it happen. But I believe now that finally we've reached a threshold, because you and I used to ask this question: when will the world wake up? How many Palestinians need to die? How many babies need to die? I think we got to that point, and people say, "Do I want this on my conscience? Do I want to go in history
No,
books?"
I think you're right, but I would disagree. I don't think it's their conscience. I think it's something more problematic because they understand the profound moral, ethical illegality and immorality of what's happening. And it's not just that it's on their conscience. There will be profound long-term political, legal consequences of all of the world leaders and all of the countries that were complicit in supplying, enabling, and complying with the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. They're trying to save their you-know-whats, Jamal. I don't think it comes from any belief, that, oh, we need to save Palestinians. I think they're kind of forward thinking a little bit and saying, well, with the ICJ ruling coming up and the legal consequences, this is going to cause a lot of problems for world leaders in the future. I just want to go back to two small things, Jamal, which happened in the last week, which are really important. This kind of flew below the radar, but it's kind of a big deal. The Israeli military admitted for the first time in 2 years that they have been lying about Hamas stealing food supplies. They'd been saying forever the reason we murder Palestinian civilians in Gaza is because we're trying to stop Hamas from stealing and taking food that they loot from all of the food coming in. That's why we kill civilians. That's why we don't let food in. We don't want Hamas to get them. The Israeli military admitted for the first time that there is no evidence whatsoever that Hamas did this. It's rather striking that they admitted this, Jamal. And it's also the United States' primary talking point that, well, Hamas takes the food, we can't let it in. It's bogus. But Israel admitted it for the first time that there's no evidence that Hamas was doing this. Second, a contractor for the Gaza Humanitarian Fund gave an interview, interestingly, and said that he bore witness to genocide and atrocities while working as a contractor for the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. So he was an American, a former, I think Navy SEAL, special operations soldier who was working in Gaza behind the lines of Israeli soldiers. And he said himself, he bore witness to mass atrocities, Israeli soldiers targeting Palestinian civilians, murdering them, as well as contractors, Jamal. This is really big news. But of course, the mainstream media didn't pick this up. So we're seeing more and more evidence of this. The fact that the Israeli military admitted that they have been lying, for they've been lying for a lot longer, but specifically on this issue about Hamas stealing, food over the years, for the last 22 months is a rather startling admission. And I believe this contractor's statements, Jamal, are going to be used by the ICJ in further litigation against Israel and the United States for their genocide.
Well, as we're speaking, just within the past days, the death toll from hunger in Gaza isn't 124. I'm talking about hours as a result of starvation, malnutrition, and lack of milk. Think about it. What kind of a person would prevent baby formula from entering Gaza? That's what Israel has been doing. Yeah.
The Israelis do this.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the hospitals continue to receive cases of severe hunger and malnutrition around the clock. And now we have like more than 900,000 children in Gaza, according to several human rights organizations, are currently suffering from hunger, with 70,000 having already entered the malnutrition phase. And I'm not an expert on this. You might know more about it, but they're talking about stage 5 of malnutrition or stage 5 of starvation, which is in many instances is irreversible. It's very
No, it is
difficult. It's not
irreversible.
like you get the food, and so these people, I guess, I mean, not people, these children are going to die, or if they survive, they will not have a healthy life afterwards because they're so
That's correct.
depleted.
Yeah,
And the United Nations, of course, Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, the UNRWA, has been warning about the child malnutrition because they've been operating, in Gaza for decades. I mean, they know, and they're talking about especially children under the age of 5, which they've not been witnessing that the numbers have doubled between March and June, basically because Israel has just tightened the noose to starve the people. And this is when I think also people are starting to see the reality of using starvation as a military tool for the Israelis. That's what, because I want to go back and to say Hamas is stealing the food, which is nonsense according to many, including the Israelis. But if Israel claims that it has destroyed more than 80% of Hamas, basically, so you're talking about like they've degraded the number of fighters supposedly by 80%. So all that food just goes to these small numbers of fighters here and there. What they're doing, just hiding it somewhere. I mean, it's such a ludicrous example. But even if you have Hamas there, do you punish an entire population, 2 million people, so you can go after Hamas? And I think that's why, again, I go back, we've reached a threshold, even for those who are without conscience, are saying, wait a minute, we got to do something because we look really bad. And that's
yeah,
why
yeah.
I do feel the Europeans are speaking out. I'm not talking about the people because the people have been demonstrating for months in the street. I'm
No, we're
talking about
talking
the
about the leaders.
governments.
Yeah, yeah. But I don't. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I don't. Even though it's a good step for them, I don't buy it. I don't believe that it's coming from a good place. I think it's a political calculation for these leaders. Macron, the analysis in the French papers was that, Macron, quote, has had enough of it, but he realized that in terms of the French population, that they were demanding a change. He didn't do it on his own because of love in his heart. And the same with Starmer in the UK, who's receiving profound pressure from his constituency. The overwhelming majority of citizens of the UK are demanding that the UK no longer be complicit in the genocide. But, Starmer is still sending weapons of mass destruction to kill civilians, Jamal. I can't be as optimistic as you are because, the fact of the starvation, let's not, there's all this emphasis, as there should be, on letting more food in. But what we're not talking about is the ongoing Israeli plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank for that matter, but especially in Gaza right now. Basically the plan is to fully engulf and control and occupy Gaza, to push 2 million Palestinians in Gaza into a small area, and to completely destroy and render completely unlivable the rest of Gaza. I mean, this plan is happening right before our eyes, Jamal, and nobody's saying anything about it. Nobody. Nobody is saying anything about this. So, yes, we need to let food in, but let's not forget the larger Israeli plan of ethnic cleansing and genocide that they planned for Gaza, and what the settlers are doing in the West Bank every single day, kicking Palestinians out of their homes in the West Bank and Jerusalem every day. I mean, there's a larger picture here, above and beyond the starvation, which is grotesque. But, the larger picture, I don't hear politicians saying anything about the ethnic cleansing plan that is being carried out by the Israeli military and government right now. Do you hear anything about it?
No, and I just want to also, respond to you, but I'm not optimistic. I'm actually quite depressed about what's going on. I'm just saying, basically, I'm talking about the optics. It's really about optics. It's
Yeah,
just
it's
like
about up.
optics. The optics got so bad, and that's why even our next story, which when I started reading it first, I thought it was kind of like heartwarming that you have more hundreds of rabbis demand Israel stop using starvation as a weapon of war, and I said, oh, that's great. because I mean, maybe they need to hear it. I don't know if they hear, if they're not listening to politicians, maybe they'll listen to religious leaders saying enough is enough. And so you have hundreds of rabbis worldwide signed a letter calling for Israel to stop using starvation as a weapon of war. And the letter goes on. This letter was posted on Friday in many outlets and newspapers across the globe. Many of them are leading rabbis across denominations, and they say that Jewish people face a grave moral crisis, and that they go on by saying, we recognize that many of us endure the huge challenges the state of Israel relentlessly confronts, surrounded for so long by enemies and facing existential threats. They have to qualify that from many quarters, but we cannot condone the mass killings of civilians, including a great many women, children, elderly, or the use of starvation, the severe limitations placed on humanitarian relief, and so forth. But again, if you read through it, Jess, you'll see that the letter is meant to say, well, you know, it doesn't look good. Doesn't look good for us to
It's
see that
optics,
Israel,
like you
you
said.
know, it's about
Optics.
optics. They don't talk about the occupation. They don't talk about the 70 years of humiliation, occupation, ethnic cleansing, and so forth, and how Gaza was and still is the largest open air prison in the Middle East, if not in the world. It's about like, well, you've killed enough. It doesn't look good. Doesn't make us look good. You should allow the food to go in. No one is willing to go deep into what's the source of the problem. That's why they're throwing all these crazy ideas. If we only kill more Palestinians, maybe they'll go away. Maybe if we kill more Palestinians, or maybe if we give them each $10,000, they will leave to another country and disappear. And no one is talking about what happened to these Palestinians, that the fact of the matter, more than 60% of the Palestinians who live in Gaza come from proper what is now called Israel. They come from Haifa, they come from the Naqab, they come from Yafa, they come from Akka, they come from all these towns. Their parents or their grandparents were ethnically cleansed from their villages, and they ended up in Gaza. And they thought if we put them in Gaza, they'll just disappear, and they haven't. So no one is looking at a solution, and that's why, to me, which is basically even talking about now France recognizing the state of Palestine in September, whether that's going to happen or not. And maybe I should jump to that story. We go back again to that roller coaster, or if you want to call it the roulette, or that ride about the two-state solution concept.
So bogus.
And
It's
then
so
we can kind of calm down the natives and start talking about that, something that we've been talking about for ages and nothing happened. And just to remind our listeners, Macron had said that he would formalize France's decision to officially recognize a Palestinian state at the UN's General Assembly in September. In fact, I think tomorrow there is a meeting about that the United States refuses to participate. And he's saying, in keeping with its historic commitment to a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, I have decided that France will recognize the state of Palestine. He wrote that, by the way, on Twitter. So you'll know that. Of course, we have 142 countries out of 193 members of the United Nations who currently recognize Palestine. But where is Palestine, Jess? Where is Palestine? We have 142 countries. Does Palestine have a border? Do people can freely travel within Palestine without Israeli checkpoints?
Yeah, well, but that's why
Does Palestine have an airport, a port, or whatever? So, okay. I mean, I'm up. Thank you, France, if they do that, if they recognize Palestine.
Such a joke, Jamal.
Because
It's a joke. It's a
well,
joke.
the only thing I look at is France. I mean, you don't have too many European countries that recognize Palestine, especially part of the European unions. You got members, Norway, Ireland, and Spain, which made that they had begun to a process to recognize Palestine. But France basically is one of Israel's closest allies, by the way, and weapon suppliers and trade partners, and a G7 member. So it is the largest and arguably most influential country in Europe to make the move. But the question is, what comes after this? I
It
mean,
doesn't change anything materially, Jamal. I mean, yes, okay, Macron and France will acknowledge and recognize Palestine as a state at the United Nations. My response to that is BFD, big frickin' deal. Okay. There's still starvation. There's still occupation. There's still ethnic cleansing. There's still settlers burning Palestinians to death in the West Bank and taking over their villages. The Israeli settlers in the last couple of days, Jamal, cut off the water supply to 30 villages in the West Bank so that they could fill their pools. I mean, so France wants to recognize Palestine as a state, but let the ethnic cleansing and the occupation continue. What kind of fiction is that? Again, optics. What is it? What does Macron really believe is going to happen? Does this the Israeli government and its system of apartheid and oppression has continued to show it doesn't care what the world community thinks. They've destroyed Lebanon. They've destroyed Syria. They've attacked Tehran. They've undermined any ability to have kind of equal human rights among Palestinians within historic Palestine. What are Palestinians supposed to be happy that Macron does this? It's too late, man. Where were you 77 years ago? Now, if there's another strategic aim that France has to do this, to put pressure on Israel, then I would say put pressure on Israel to do what, Jamal? To do what?
well, the only way you can put pressure on Israel, you cannot just say like I want to recognize Palestine, but I want to keep the Israeli embassy in Paris. I want to keep supplying them with military
Weapons.
hardware. I'm going to keep having this multi-billion economical trade with them and so forth. There is no pressure. It's just like ink on paper. That's what's going to happen. France will recognize Palestine if that happens, because it hasn't happened yet as of September. They'll have an ambassador there in Palestine who will submit his credentials to Macron. They'll have an office for him. They'll fly the Palestinian flag, and that's it. That is it. Listen, as we're talking, just the past few hours, another ship, another aid ship, was intercepted. It's called the Handala Gaza-bound ship carrying aid and activists. Uh, got intercepted in international water by Israel. This happened to the ship before it. Both ships, and I think even another ship, they all carried French citizens. The last ship carried a French or an EU MP, no, a French MP on it. What has France, did France do anything about that?
No, nothing.
You know,
Nothing.
so I mean, we're talking about a bunch of activists, politicians, musicians, actors and so forth, trying to deliver aid that Israel is preventing to go in, and France cannot do anything about it. You know, it's I think, at this point, Israel doesn't care. And as long as the United States supports Israel, they don't care if every single country recognizes Palestine, as long as the United States doesn't recognize Palestine and keep supplying it with the $3.8 billion a year, and keeps supplying it with weapons, and keeps vetoing every resolution. Because, okay, once you recognize Palestine, Palestine is not a member of a country at the United Nations. It just has an observer status. What's going to happen afterwards? One country will try to recognize Palestine as a state, and then the United States will veto that, and we'll
Yeah,
go back
exactly.
to square one.
That's exactly right, Jamal. That's why I can tell you that most Palestinians, the majority in Palestine and the diaspora, are not like tickled or happy or excited or celebrating Macron's declaration, because, as you said, this is just for optics, doesn't change anything materially on the ground. They have an ambassador in Paris, big deal. Just going back to what you said and what we've said for a long time, the only thing that the Israeli government listens to And they've described this as their only real existential threat because their existential threat is not from Iran. It's not from Lebanon. It's not from the Houthis. The only existential threat that Israel knows and acknowledges is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and putting pressure on Israel economically to boycott Israeli goods, to sanction Israel, to economically squeeze it. That's the only thing that we know will ultimately force the Israeli government to do anything differently. Otherwise, they're going to continue full steam ahead. Why? What's the incentive, Jamal? You have billions of dollars in trade. The EU continues to send billions of dollars in military aid and weapons to kill Palestinian civilians. So they have a Palestinian state. Big deal, man. Israel's not going to stop any of their grotesque genocide and ethnic cleansing unless economic pressure is put on them. And that's why they always freak out, Jamal, about the BDS movement, because the BDS movement is picking up steam. It continues to garner international support among people on the ground and communities on the ground. And eventually, it's going to build a tremendous amount of momentum that world leaders may not have the choice anymore to ignore the BDS movement. That's really the only thing that will put pressure on Israel.
Yeah, and look at what they're doing now. Aside from killing Palestinians in Gaza, they're just like going full force in trying to basically annex the West Bank. There are calls. They voted in the Israeli Knesset
Right.
and to basically annex the West Bank. So where is that Palestinian state? That's the West Bank. It's gone. And roughly now you have 7.2, 7.3 million Palestinians living in historic Palestine, and you have seven equal number, maybe a little bit even less Israelis living there. And so what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have full-fledged apartheid because that's what's going on. And they know that. They can annex, the West Bank. They have two options. The third option is not going to give them a peace of mind. One option is really to go ahead with their extermination plan because that's what they're doing.
Right.
I mean, kill every single Palestinian or make their life so miserable that they'll pack their bags and leave somewhere else, or follow President Trump's plan to have Libya accept 1 million. But there is 7.3. Where is the 6.3 million Palestinians going to go to? Egypt has refused to take any Palestinians. Arab countries have refused. Jordan has more than its share with Palestinians. The new Syrian government is getting rid of Palestinians there. Lebanon has also more than its share and size of Palestinians. So, let's not play around. It's just like, really, to get rid of the Palestinians, you have to exterminate them. And I use that word because there is a precedent. There's a precedent to that in World War II. And pogroms and the Holocaust and whatever. And that's, I think, where Israel is heading to, or at least some of their leadership. Maybe they're not saying it outright, and others are saying it outright, like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but then they say, oh, these are the crazy people. Well, they're not so crazy. A few years ago, Ben-Gvir was a criminal in Israel. He was convicted, and people would laugh if you mentioned to them that he will be one day a member of the Knesset, not let alone to become a minister, and so close to the government. And this is where he is. So the other scenario is, like I said, is that annexation, and you have population A and population B, which is going to be, Jim Crow style ruling, which is basically the whole apartheid, and that's what's going to happen. And if the world is going to accept that, Palestinians are not going to accept it. And the last one is what they want is, because they don't want to absorb the Palestinians in the population, they want to create what they've been doing, Bantustan, small, just shrink the land, put them like in places like Gaza, cage them in, overcrowd them, and say, they're not part of the state of Israel, but they live there. They don't have Israeli passports. They cannot vote. They're not full citizens, just like what's happening with people in Jerusalem, for example. Palestinians in Jerusalem, they have just an Israeli ID, but they are not citizens, and so forth. It's like the plan is very obvious. It's what's happening is very obvious, and so don't kind of like fool yourself to think that by getting France's recognition or other countries' recognition without forcing Israel to respect the international law, without even bringing Benjamin Netanyahu, who's wanted by the ICC, is flying back and forth in the United States over French airspace, over different European airspace. If this was the president of Sudan, which happened, he will be intercepted by NATO planes and so forth. So we are kind of like
Exactly.
playing this game, and sadly, people are believing it.
No, well, but the people who are believing it, Jamal, are not the Palestinians and not the majority of people in the Arab world who know this game and who know this game well. Palestinians aren't buying this rubbish from Macron. They're not buying it. No, I mean, it is absolutely a joke, and we need to acknowledge this kind of obvious political optics game that the Israelis play, as well as what people in the United States who claim to be liberal or progressive say. Because their analysis is that this is just a problem of a right wing Israeli government. It's a Netanyahu problem. It's a Ben Gvir problem. It's a Smotrich problem. But that's bogus. This is not an extremist problem that if these extremist leaders somehow went away, that everything would be so much better for Israelis and Palestinians and historic Palestine. That's all rubbish, Jamal, because there's no difference. You alluded to this early. The majority of Israeli citizens, the majority of Jewish Israeli citizens, Jamal, want ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. They want the starvation in Gaza. This is not a Netanyahu versus non-Netanyahu analysis. This is what the state of Israel wants. This is their intention. So let's not buy into this rubbish that somehow this has to do with Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and it's just the settlers. This is a systemic racist state that whose intention is very clear, irrespective, Jamal, of who's in government. And I think that's the analysis that we have to keep really clear and focused on.
Okay, just we have a few minutes. Our last story, and this is the work of multiple organizations and
Yeah.
independent journalists and so forth. The Electronic Intifada Mondawais, the Intercept, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and Palestinian writers who have exposed the fraudulence of the so-called paper of record, which is the New York Times, for decades, which basically has chosen, which its journalists have chosen to ignore, whitewash, distort, or justify Israel's crimes in Gaza. Okay. And so there is a whole, what they call a dossier. They've kind of gathered evidence in a
Yeah.
dossier talking about all the different anti-Palestinian bias, starting from the headlines. We've talked about this before. Israelis get murdered and killed, but Palestinians just die, mysteriously die. Who killed them? They never mention they were killed by an Israeli bomb. They just say 70 Palestinians killed in Rafah, for example, and without giving you context to this. And then when you compare it, how when they talk about what happens to the Israelis, they mention them. They have personal stories about who people died. So we're talking about like hundreds of headline corrections. Basically, this has become a game, or for many, I would say, journalists and people who are influencers, correcting always the New York Times headline to just show, that's becoming like basically a favorite discussion tool for them. And revisionism and setting the record straight to tell the truth. So they have, of course, wrote about also the 20 high-ranking editors, executives, and journalists who covered the war in Gaza. Guess what? And I'm sure you're not surprised. They all
What?
have ties to Israel.
Oh, what a surprise,
Yeah, they
Jamal.
all have
What a
some
surprise.
tie here and there. And if in any other place You will never assign someone, let's say, covering the war between Russia and Ukraine who has a son serving in the Russian army or the Ukrainian army. But when it comes to Israel, that's fine. It's okay to have that. Or having even served in the military itself. So
Exactly.
these people, and they name them. I don't want to go through all their names because I said, if we give some examples, they talk about Nathan Odenheimer, who served in the Maglan Special Forces Commando Unit of the Israeli Occupation Army. And now he is the Jerusalem correspondent for the New York Times. He writes about what? Guess what? He writes about Gaza. He embeds with who? He embeds with the IDF, his former brothers in arms. I mean, how non-biased is that, Jess? I mean, how, to have someone who served in the military goes there to cover a conflict, an important conflict. They talk about Isabel Kirchner, who is the mother of two former Israeli IDF soldiers and the wife of another. Okay? And she's been there for decades. And then after his tour, Kirchner's husband went on to direct an Israeli think tank's program on information strategy, a department tasked with shaping a positive image of Israel in the media. Yet she is a star at the New York Times. So anyway, because we don't have a lot of times, there is an interesting article about this in Mondoweiss that summarizes what we started to talk about. Start talking about these different individuals and calling the New York Times out. I mean, I don't know if they're going to change their mind, but it's kind of like, again, horrendous to have this many reporters who either served in the Israeli military or have the next of kin is in the Israeli military, and you expect them to be not biased. It's basic journalism 101.
Yeah. And, Jamal, you and I have been speaking about this for 20 years, right? When we have spoken about it, people will turn their heads, roll their eyes, say whatever. But the information that this collective group has put together is indisputable. And the New York Times has not only helped, but enabled and sustained the Israeli ongoing occupation and genocide of Palestine and Gaza by employing and supporting these 20 basically pro-Israel journalists covering the war in an unbiased way. It's kind of disgusting, but Jamal, we've been talking about this for 20 years. Hey, it's important. We've been on the air for 20 years, Jamal. This is our 20-year anniversary. Someone said to me the other day, hey, I was going through old podcasts of Arab Talk, and I was shocked that what you guys are talking about in 2025 is not that different from what you were talking about in 2005. So I think on that note, we need to say we are going to continue to talk about this for another 20 years, inshallah. And that, again, thanks to all our viewers and listeners for being with us for the last 20 years. We're going to keep going strong in the future. Thanks to KPOO. Thanks to JJ and the memory of Terry. We're going to continue to go strong here on Arab Talk, Jamal.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.